to our first point, the point of a learning environment. Now, what we see on side government is something that is completely natural. No, thank you. We see that the majority of teenagers are naturally attracted to the opposite sex. This is a simple fact. This is a feeling that simply comes with being an adolescent teenager. We don't see anything wrong with this. This is a completely natural feeling. However, we feel that it impairs one's ability to work efficiently and to the best of one's ability. Sure.
Would you have both male and female teachers at these same-sex schools?
Yes. Yes, of course. We would have whichever teacher we feel could best work with the students that they are presenting with. This is the way that schools operate today. This is what we prefer. We see no reason to change this. Continuing. Once again, we believe that while this is a completely natural feeling, it impairs one's ability to work as efficiently as one is capable. We believe that students should be working as efficiently as possible and to the best of their ability. The best that they are capable of performing should be what they are performing. And what we see is that single-sex schools is the way to do this. If a male person is trying to do a debate or make a presentation or do his work in class, and instead of focusing upon the work or debate or presentation, the more important thing that he is working on, he is distracted by that cute girl sitting in front of him. This is a problem. This is going to impair his ability to do what he is doing to the best that he is capable. This is once again a proven fact. In fact, 40% more in Canada of children that go to single-sex schools will move on to university. This proves to us that single-sex schools are not only more efficient, but they help children and teenagers to work to the best of their ability. We see that this is a great thing about single-sex schools, and that is one of the main reasons why we prefer them to co-ed schools. Once again though, we see that this feeling is not a bad feeling. This feeling is completely natural. However, it impairs one's ability to work. No thank you. This does, however, this example I promoted, work vice versa as well. We see the side opposition cannot argue with our numbers. We see that this point is a very strong point. This is possibly our main reason why we prefer single-sex schools to ones of coeducational. Once again, this is a proven fact. Adolescents are going to be attracted and distracted by members of the opposite sex. This is the problem, and this is why we prefer single-sex schools. But then also in this point of learning environment, we see that the learning environment of the school also has an influence on the teachers at the school. Not only does it affect the students and help them work better, it also affects the teachers and the other faculty members of the school. We believe that it is far easier and far less time-consuming. It takes far less dedication and patience to work, no thank you, with students that are behaving properly and paying perfect attention to everything concerning the lesson that is being taught. We believe that in coeducational schools, this is not always the case. What we would say, no thank you, is that in coeducational schools, it is much more difficult to be a teacher, much more time-consuming, much more frustrating because of the distraction factor. We believe that teaching distracted students takes far more patience and is far more time-consuming, far more difficult than teaching a bunch of kids who are paying perfect attention to everything concerning the lecture or lesson that is being given. This is again why we prefer single-sex schools to coeducational ones. Now, on to our second point, the point of influence. And this point of influence is influence upon the parents of the children who are either going or not going to single-sex schools. But we believe that having your child go or attend a single-sex school is a great influence on the parents and will relieve much stress from their lives. The parents of these children want their children to be performing to the best of their ability and to the best that they are capable. They want them to go on and do great things with their life. They want them to go on to university, to college, past secondary school, past high school. This happens once again far more often in single-sex schools. Once again, this is a proven fact. Knowing that their children, the children of the parents that the children are going and attending a safe, secure, efficient environment. No, thank you. This is another great thing that we love about single-sex schools. This is going to ease the minds of the parents. It is going to make the parents feel more safe, more secure, and more confident in the school system that we have today. So what have we talked about today, and what are we going to continue to talk about down the bench? Well, first of all, we talked about the learning environment and how the learning environment is a positive influence on both the students and the teachers in a school. We then went on to prove that that not only the learning environment, but the way that the school works in general, the single-sex schools, has a positive influence on the parents' minds as well. My honorable colleague is going to be talking to you today about freedom and about equality. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Now I'd like to call upon the first speaker of this opposition, Madeline, to present the case.
Children are only 33% of our population, but 100% of our future. And only one team today is providing for the future of our world, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is Team Opposition. Today, Team Opposition will prove to you why we must not prefer same-sex schools to co-educational schools, and that any denial of this claim is a hindrance to social cooperation and success, and a denial of the blatant truth. And we will prove this to you through the following 2 points. First, we will look at how separatism creates inequality, and secondly, we will understand the benefits of co-educational schools. I will address the first 2 points, and then my second speaker will readdress the first 2 points and continue to extend them within the arguments. So up and down the bench, Team Opposition will stand by the line that inequality does not solve inequality. And with that, I would like to start by refuting some of my opponent's points. So their first point was about the learning environment. They stated that a majority of people feel that it is natural to feel attracted to the opposite sex, and that creates a strong distraction. They bring about that creating same-sex schools will show a strong working ability within these students. But in real life, we need to learn how to deal with distractions. In real life, we need to learn how to work with the opposite sex. And by putting a Band-Aid on this, we are not allowing these people to deal with real-life situations, and we are setting them up for failure in the real world. It creates a learning environment that is simply not realistic. And when we are doing this, we are creating large problems within our world. They also say that it will improve people, that it will impose the best ability on people capable. No, what it will do is provide a hindrance to operate in the real world. And this is an extremely pressing problem, yes.
We never said anything about getting rid of co-ed schools. We simply said that we prefer the single-sex schools that we already have set up today.
In my points, I will prove to you why co-ed schools are far more important and far more beneficial than the single-sex schools, but for now I would like to tear down some of their arguments, and I will enter them in my case. Then they stated the statistic that 40% of people going to single-sex schools in their home country of Canada are more likely to go to university. First of all, in Canada, most of these same-sex schools are private, so that provides a large influence in them going to university because they have more money, more resources, and so forth. And similarly, this 40% statistic does not represent just people going to universities, which is in fact a skewed statement, but it represents people more likely to promote separatism and sexism within society. And this is an extremely pressing problem that we cannot promote through same-sex schools.
On that point.
No, thank you. They also said that people are less distracted but they cannot prove that people are less distracted because people will still be distracted by friends. They will still be distracted by dances and all of these things. So just eliminating one sex and eliminating one side that in fact does allow for a great deal of positive things within the society is not in fact solving the problem, but is creating more problems within the future. Now their second point was about influence. They said that in single-sex schools we will have a larger and greater influence. However, the only influence that they are receiving is separatism and sexism, and that something is inherently different between males and females, and that is why they must be separated. So preaching this difference within these schools is setting them up for future failure in society. So with that, I'd like to enter my first point, that separatism creates inequality. You cannot solve inequality by using inequality. When we require students to attend same-sex schools based on their gender, we are setting the education system and cooperation within society up for failure. In many Arab countries, for example, and developing countries, we will see that they will use this tool as an excuse to exclude women from proper education, and that women are already oppressed. Now, when they exclude women from proper education, we see a variety of different things. First of all, when women are put at a lower status than men, a great deal of social harm occurs. It is an excuse to further gender violence. In Afghanistan, a group of radical terrorists put acids in the vents of an all-girls school. 2 people died and everyone in the school got sick. So we see that with this separatism in gender violence, it is easier to perform this gender violence and it becomes more commonplace. Yes?
But we do not agree that it was just co-ed schools, the girls were not likely to go there anyway because there was boys and not allowed to mix with boys.
If boys were in this school, then these radical societies that prefer men over women would not be attacked because the women would be coexisting with the men, learning influences from the men, and not be put at a lower standard than men. And that is the inherent difference between these two arguments and why we must have these co-educational schools. Now, secondly, when women don't have an education, all male schools arise, and we see that women are suppressed from education. In their argument in stratifying these two schools, the men will become more dominant in society, and then they will suppress the women. And we have seen this in the past, and we have seen the negative impacts of this. We will be reverting back to these times. Without education, we see exclusion within society, less political rights, favoritism within society, which all lead to inequality. Now, secondly, it increases the divide in the mindset of gender equality. If one school gets more money, for example, if one school gets better resources, if one school gets better teachers, or larger success in the real world, then we will be providing tangible evidence that one gender is greater than another. And in doing so, we are setting the society up for failure because we are proving that these two genders are unequal, are incapable of coexisting with each other, and quite possibly one is greater than the other. Now, our second point, benefits to co-educational schools. It is not realistic to say that in the real world, the society will be separated by gender, because this is simply not what happens in the real world. When people are preached this idea from a young age and from a young mindset of sexism, schools are where they develop their identity. And when they are raised with separatism, they will grow up with that mindset. Now in their POI, Team Proposition stated that they will have both men and women working as teachers within the society. Well, first of all, we will allow the men will be able to rise up and preach their ideals to these women, creating inequality and further sexism within society, and it will provide for unequal job opportunities within society because women who will not be able to teach at the men's schools, if we have this sexism within society, will have their jobs taken away by the men that are able to teach at the women's schools, because this is simply how society works. So going back to our argument, when people are preached this idea of inequality at a young age and separatism at a young age, we have a mindset of inequality because they will have no exposure and no interaction to the other sex. So this provides a disadvantage of how they coexist, so that when we take them out of the schooling systems, they will think that something is inherently different between these two genders, and they will have radical ideas of why they are different, and they will not be able to coexist because they have not been provided with the opportunity to learn how to in their schooling when they were developing their mindsets and identity. And this is not a precedent that we can be setting. This is a mindset that sets societal cooperation up for failure. And so throughout our debate, we see that we cannot fix inequality with inequality. And we cannot lose this tool of cooperation and open-minded policy that only co-educational schools bring. And that is where we are proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker, for her speech. Time was 8 minutes and 17 seconds. I would now like to call on the second speaker of today's proposition, Terry, continuing the case for her side. Please welcome.
Mr. Speaker, today we've heard from a side opposition that believes simply because you separate genders, one automatically becomes weaker than the other than they would in the co-ed schools. We see that this is false, they have no backing to prove it up, and that they're assuming a lot of things. What I'm going to do today is talk about the clash, which is my main clash, which is the point of inequality, which actually ties in perfectly because I'm then going to bring forth a point of freedom and then bring forth another point of equality, so that ties in perfectly. But first of all, I'm going to talk about one of their main assumptions, that it's a band-aid. That simply because you go to this school, simply because if you were to go to a girls' school, you go to a guy's school, you live in a bubble in which you never meet the other gender outside of school. We see that's false. If you participate in activities such as debating, which is a co-ed sport, you are likely to meet the other gender, regardless of whether or not you go to a single-sex school, as actually many debaters do if you talk to them. And you see that you're not living in a bubble, you'll probably interact with these people. We're simply saying that the education is better if you were to interact with the other, if you were to not interact with the other gender, but you would disagree.
Ma'am, yes, I do disagree. I think that the education system is where children form their views. This is where they form their social views, their political views, and their views on gender. That's why it's important that they're included in education.
Okay, I see what you're getting at here, but I don't think it says that whether or not there's males or females in your school is as important as, I think you're going to pay more attention to the learning, which I think is more important than whether or not you're developing views about what males are like or what females are like. We think you're probably likely to develop those outside of school anyway, outside of school where you have social interactions. We think that's the place where you're going to develop your views on what people are like. So what they talked about with inequality. So I don't have a lot of clash on this because essentially my point is equality, so we think it ties in really well, and even the examples they brought up, I will be able to refute within my point. But then they talked about the female schools, and I brought up in a POI that isn't it better that they're getting educated, because I talk on my point, it used to be co-ed schools, so they started to open up girls' schools so these girls could get educated, so they could be educated in the same way as the male, and I'll talk about that a bit more. And also they said that simply because they talked about competition. And we inside proposition, we think that simply because there's competition between schools doesn't mean you should shut one down. We see even with co-educational schools, you probably have one school that's better than the other, one school's getting more funding than the other, but we don't think you should shut the other one down because it says that people from one part of the town are better than the other part of the town. We see that's illogical if you were to compare it to a co-educational school, Mr. Speaker. And they talked about how the boys will become more dominant. And we see they never really had any backup with that. How all of a sudden is separating the genders going to make one more dominant than the other than you would have in co-educational school? We see a lot of these boys are probably actually going to meet with females outside of school, so they're probably not going to become the whole separatist, separatist extremists that you're making them out to be. And actually, we see that putting girls in an all-girls school isn't making them weaker than males. It's putting them in an empowering situation where there's other females, there's positive female role models. You see, there's positive female role models from other students and teachers saying, you know what, because you're a girl, we believe you can succeed, and that's why we're taking all this time to educate you and giving you a more specialized education. And I also want to talk about briefly how they talked about the teachers and how the male teachers were going to take all the female teachers. And my alma colleague, when he responded to the POI about female or male teachers, he responded that simply we'd pick the ones which we think teach best. And actually, it's likely that in all girls schools, female teachers teach the best. It's likely that in all boys schools, male teachers teach the best, but we're not going to limit it because we think that there are people who have special characteristics that do teach to genders particularly well. And we're just going to do what any other school does and accept whichever teacher has the best qualities. No, thank you. So into my constructive about freedom. This is directly correlating to my partner's point about what the students, the teachers, and the parents want. And I'm kind of making it more. I'm kind of just building on what the students is better for them. And we think it's better that you have more freedom to be who you want to be without the fear of judgment from romantic interests. We think you're more likely to be yourself when you're not worrying about what some guy or girl is thinking about you. No, thank you. I think that it's better that the students are able to learn and to be themselves around other people without questioning what some guy is thinking about them, what some girl is thinking about them. You're more able to develop your interests without the pressure of the opposite gender. And we acknowledge before you POI us on this and before you rebut us on this, we acknowledge that this isn't going to eradicate peer pressure altogether. You will still have peer pressure from the same gender, you'll still have peer pressure from the same sex. But what we're going to acknowledge that this will significantly diminish the peer pressure in these social circles. Significantly diminish it. So on to my second point. What do I have? Okay, on to my second point. So equality, and this directly ties into their point of inequality, which is great for me and probably not so great for them. So I'm talking about in many places such as the Middle East, many girls could not go to school before because their parents didn't want them to go to a school where there was boys or where they might interact with boys. And then they opened up girls' schools so the girls could get educated. But 1 second please, let me finish my sentence. And so they opened up girls' schools so the girls could get educated, just not with the males. But you would not agree.
Assuming that they open up these girls' schools to protect women and to shield women from the oppression within society, once they leave these schools, they will be subjected to it, but they won't know how to deal with it. And that will set them up for societal danger and for not success within society.
No, we don't agree with that. We think that the more educated they are, they're going to be better able that when they go into the real world to say, look, what you're saying to me is wrong, your point of view is wrong, I think I should have the same equality as you. We think that's a fundamental fact that you're missing here. You're assuming that because they're going to a same-sex school, that they're all of a sudden going to become weaker. We think that the more educated these girls in these parts of the country are, they're going to be much better able saying, no, what you're saying to me is wrong, and I want my place among males. And that actually directly ties into what I was going to talk about my point. It's like you're reading my mind. Anyway, so we want girls to be educated, and we believe that it's better that they're educated in single-sex schools if that means that most girls get an education. We think that's the main point here. It's not whether or not in these countries, it's not whether or not these girls and boys are being educated together. It's making sure that these girls are getting education. And we see that for a lot of these girls, the only way they're going to be allowed to get an education by the family is by making sure that they're going to an all-girls school. And then they can go into the real world and make sure that they stand up for themselves. So we believe in these countries that if the girls are educated, then they stand a better chance of being seen as equal to the boys, and thus making single-sex schools desirable, because once they're equal, they'll be able to voice their opinion. They'll be more likely to voice their opinions than some girl who's always been stuck at home being told that you're not as good as boys. And for all the and what have I brought forth today? I've talked about freedom and equality, and my alma colleague was going to rebut whatever points they're bringing up. And I've also talked about clash, their inequality point, which directly tied to my equality point. So for all the reasons I brought forth today, all the reasons opposition has failed to bring forth and will fail to bring forth, we are proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you, speaker, for your speech. Time was 7 minutes and 49 seconds. proposition for child.
Separate can never be equal. This was the phrase used by the United States Supreme Court to negate a policy of segregation of facilities based on race during times of segregation in the United States. We argue that they use the same excuses that side proposition has brought up in this debate, that we will have separate but equal facilities. And as it has been proven time and time again, this is simply untrue. We on the opposition are proud to oppose the motion that this House prefers single-sex schools to coeducational schools, and we stand by the team line that you cannot use inequality to solve inequality. Now, before I go into our constructive case, I'm first going to tell you why all of the proposition's arguments are inherently flawed. Now, they essentially have two arguments in this debate. First of all, that it creates a better learning environment because it reduces distraction between genders. We argue a few things. First of all, that students need to learn to live with these distractions because we keep on promoting this idea that that men and women somehow cannot work together. And all they are doing is continuing to promote this idea, and we are creating a solution. We are stopping this attitude and this mindset in the world by saying you learn to live with these distractions, which we believe they cannot inherently prove are in schools today anyways. And we move on to further better our society. But furthermore, this logic in itself promotes sexism because in these schools, you are creating a divisive mindset by arguing that two different genders, by creating a situation in which different genders are learning different things about the world. They have tailored education that promotes either a male-dominated view or a women's empowerment view, both of which I will argue are inherently flawed. But furthermore, we argue it creates a bad precedent in society because we see that the logic that they use can actually be related to the workplace. It can be related anywhere after school. That this idea that men and women are distractions, so they should just never work together. This creates a cycle. If men and women can't work together, then why don't we just have separate societies for them? We see this logic in itself is flawed and cannot be used in school because it just creates this dangerous precedent. Now, furthermore, they are writing off gender equality as a distraction in order to push the problem away and deal with it later. And we argue that we need to deal with it now. Now, furthermore, essentially their only second argument is this idea of equality and arguing that at least these kids are actually educated. But we say a few things to this as well. First of all, we are putting pressure on regions in developing countries in which they may not even be able to afford multiple schools for multiple genders. So by promoting single-sex education, they may only be able to open up one school. And let's guess which gender that school will be of. It'll probably be a male school. So we'll either have a few coeducational schools and one all-male school in which they promote a male-dominated version of history and a male-dominated version of all these other divisive viewpoints, and we argue that this is simply not right. We argue that you are not getting a quality education when you are promoting in the essential idea of school that you cannot work together with another gender. Okay, so they've also said that you can meet other genders in other activities, but first of all, by arguing that in itself, you are conceding to the idea that interaction with other genders is a good thing. And furthermore, we've already stated that you are forming your views in education, in school, and that is why it's essential to have different genders together in school. They also have argued that even in coeducational institutions, there can be inequalities. We argue that at least you have equal opportunity to go to these coeducational schools. That if the male school has all the resources and the women's school does not have them, then inherently, because you are female, you get less resources. Yes?
What grounds are you assuming that the male schools will be the school that's better?
Yes, because we have shown you over and over again through history, as the proposition has even conceded to, that today we have a problem with women and men going to the same school. We see that male are more valued in some societies inherently, and so thus those male schools will probably be the ones that are favored by the government and will actually have more resources. So moving on to their idea that we should promote women's empowerment. To that we also say a few things. First of all, that in itself we argue that we do not need empowerment, we need equality. And that's because you are creating a double standard in society, because if I came up here and said we should be promoting male empowerment, it would just sound sexist. So we argue that we are not arguing that one gender is better than the other, we are arguing that they are equal. And furthermore, that if you can argue that it creates women's empowerment in women's schools, why can't you argue that it creates male empowerment in male schools? And you create the system in which both genders believe that they are better than the other. Okay, moving on to our constructive case, that first of all, separatism creates inequality. And second of all, that there are many benefits to coeducational schools which you would not get in single schools. So first of all, separatism creates inequality. We argue that there is actually not equal opportunity in these schools because women can easily be excluded from the education system or simply be put into schools that have much less resources than a male school. We argue, and we have seen over and over again, that in the Arab world and in the developing world, women are often excluded and they have not promoted women's education. We have seen this in the case of Malala in Pakistan, in which she tried to get an education for women, and all we see is the Taliban shooting her, essentially, because they do not want her to get an education. And we argue that, furthermore, making female schools might even put targets on these all-female schools, in which extremist groups like the Taliban can easily target them and try to take down women's education because the system is inherently unequal and inherently separated. We argue that, again, the idea that separate is inherently unequal is important and has not been addressed by the proposition. And as I have already stated, we would be essentially disenfranchising developing regions that may not even be able to afford to create one school. Because we would be promoting single-sex education, then they would be forced to make 2 educational facilities to educate everyone. And if they can't afford that, they would probably settle for only creating 1 school that is all male. So why is it important that we are creating separate and unequal societies? We argue not only will these schools become easier targets for extremist groups and and the government to take down themselves because maybe they do not want women to get an education. Furthermore, women would get less resources. We argue that essentially we would be creating women would be trapped in this cycle because women don't have a place in coeducational society. We would be putting them in worse schools that have less quality education, and they would be less able to prove themselves that they are equal after they come out of school because they would be having this lesser education. They would not be performing as well as males, and we create this self-fulfilling prophecy. The women aren't doing as well in school because we are putting them in single-sex facilities, and we are proving the stereotype, essentially, or furthering it at least, because women and men would be in different schools, and they would get different resources and different opportunities. Moving on to our second point of contention, that there are many benefits to coeducational schools. We have shown you that this is unlike the real world, and that if you take their logic and move it and extend it into other aspects of society, it is simply ridiculous. And we say that when you grow up without exposure to another gender, and you grow up with the idea of inherent inequality in school, that you're creating this double standard which does not leave children when they go out of school and go into the real world and the workforce. We argue that we've seen throughout history that when you exclude people, all you create is tension, you create misunderstanding and miscommunication, and less ability to actually cooperate. And we have seen this in terms of education systems in different schools which promote ideals of either nationalism or ideals of promoting one view over another. For example, in Israel and Palestine, which we have already talked about. So in the end, we have shown you that essentially creating unequal schools is not the right way to solve inequality. It's essentially making the problem worse and trapping women in the cycle of inequality. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now today I'm mainly going to be focusing on my rebuttal when I do a point-by-point takedown of each of their points, and then I'll move on to some summary. Now to begin, we talked a lot in the first half of this debate, and slightly less in the second half, about distractions, and about whether distractions are caused in co-ed and in single-sex schools. Now, they told us we can't prove that these distractions happen and that people are distracted by the opposite gender or the opposite sex in these co-ed schools. We see this as chemically false. There are hormones released in the brain during adolescent teenage years, the time period we specified in our model, that prove they will be distracted, that prove they won't be able to work to their maximum potential. Now, They said, well, yes, but if there are these distractions, it's good to learn from distractions. It's good to learn to overcome distractions. We believe it is good to overcome distractions, but we believe people won't want to overcome distractions, no thank you, that they enjoy. We don't believe they view these as distractions from educations because of the mindset of, I'll take you in a moment, because of the mindset, because of what they're thinking. They're thinking of that as their primary goal, not as a distraction. And they learn rather to overcome it, to accept it, and to endorse it. Yes?
Using the logic of the proposition, we would simply be separating friends from each other and just putting them in different schools because that creates a distraction. This is an illogical argument.
Thank you. We're not proposing cutting off relations, and we're not proposing any of this. We're not saying people of the opposite gender won't be friends. What we are speaking simply about what happens inside the schoolyard. We don't believe that these genders won't meet the opposite sex outside of school. We don't believe they won't create lasting friendships. This doesn't happen. We are just trying to give these people the best education we can, because that is what we must do with our duty as the government.
Sir.
No, thank you. Now, they were talking about, a big point in this debate was about equality. And is it equality or not? And does it promote equality in states and countries that are rather male-dominated? Well, we see that it does promote equality because it promotes critical thinking and delivers an education. No, thank you. In these rather male-dominated states, we can look at in places in the Middle East, such as Pakistan, where Malala was shot. We see that these co-ed schools are much more dangerous than any single-sex school that could be made. They said there was acid put in the vents of an all-girls school. Yes, that happened. But imagine how dangerous it would be for those girls to be going into a school, walking next to the boys that killed them with acid. We don't see how separating them from those that are trying to harm them is going to help them.
Sir.
We see that, no thank you. We see many people would be too afraid to go to school, Malala being an exception because in fact she didn't go to an all-girls school, she went to a co-ed school, and it was because boys on the bus knew she was going to be on the bus and told Taliban to come and shoot her. We see that they are much more encouraged to go to school whenever they're not going to be in as much danger. We see they're much more encouraged to critically think. But why is this all so important? How does this, in the end of the day, help the equality in these countries? Well, we see throughout history, education has been suppressed when a group of people have wanted to be suppressed. When you can't critically think, when you can't think about the fact you're being oppressed for the wrong reasons, it's impossible to revolt. It's impossible until you think about what's happening and you realize your predicament. You can't do anything. So we see by educating and by giving these opportunities, by opening these schools, we are creating the possibility for these girls to get an education, and we are helping the future of equality. Now, they spoke about how whenever you're separated from other schools, that you make assumptions. You think, well, you know what, this school, they maybe get more stuff, they're better than me. I think my partner dealt with that quite well by saying you don't think a school on the other side of town is better because they don't have as big a library. But they said you also make assumptions about the opposite gender. We see there's a contradiction in their case here. They said that school and those you meet at school are when you form your political opinions, your opinions on the opposite gender. We see when they are not exposed to the opposite gender within school that this doesn't make a difference. So although we don't stand by either of those points, I would just like to point out the contradiction in their case. Now, thank you. But when you're separated like this, and when you're separated in these schools, I'm going to bring up an example. Now, I'm in a theater troupe. We work at a community theater. Say I do drama, and there's a comedy troupe. But I've never actually seen them. I mean, I've seen snippets of comedy outside of school, sure, on the TV, but I've never actually seen them in the theater. That doesn't make me think, oh, comedy isn't in the same theater at me. They suck. I don't form an opinion on comedy about that. But imagine if, no thank you, but imagine if I saw that same comedy troupe in the same theater as me. And perhaps they performed slightly worse simply because of the group, not because of the fact they're performing comedy. I would think less of them. I would think less of them if we were sharing the theater and they happened to be worse. We see this is the same for coeducational schools. I'll take you in a moment. Whenever the groups are put together and one group happens to perform worse than the other, we see this is when sexism and this is when stereotypes come into place. Yes?
Even though your personal opinion might cause you to think less of them, you will be forced to learn how to work with them and cooperate in a real-world situation because that is how society works.
We don't see how being in the same school as these other people forces you to cooperate with them, because we see there's bullying in school. There are all these things where you can simply, those who you think less of, you're not forced to cooperate with them in school. They're not like co-workers, they're just people in the same building as you. You generally choose who you want to be in a project with, who you do your homework with. It's not like the real world. And we see that because of this, we must educate them in the best way possible to prepare them for the real world. Now, they spoke about those male-dominated countries, and they said, well, in most countries, generally they're more inclined towards males, and because of that, the government will give money to the male schools first. Well, first, the majority, we don't see that in the majority of countries this is the case. And where it is the case, they're geared enough towards men to have us need our own girls' school, so that the girls in the co-ed school don't get undertaught, so that they don't get priority. We see when we give them an all-girls school, girls are the only priority. And we see the same vice versa. If we have an all-boys school, they are the priority. We don't see how separating them and giving them their own place and giving them their own place where they are the most important people will make them feel less important. Now, I'm going to move on to some summary of the round. Now, this round is really boiled down to three main questions. The first is, will they learn better in a co-ed or a single-sex environment? Will they make connections between them and the opposite gender? And will it promote equality? Well, to answer the first question, yes. Working in single-sex schools will make education better. As we've stated multiple times and continue to knock down their rather flimsy rebuttal, it does, and especially with our facts, there are distractions. There are proven distractions. You are proven not to do this. We see that there are no benefits. We promote equality, and we see there are no large differences between the genders, apart from perhaps physical things. And so we see that working with the other group won't really promote much, but it will cause distractions. Now, will they make connections? We believe this is side opposition lingered on this for a while, but we believe it doesn't make a difference because they'll meet them outside of school. Now, will it promote equality? We believe it will promote equality because it will help around the world, and it will help people become empowered because they will be the priority where they are. They will be the most important, and they will be empowered. For all the reasons we on side government have stated, side opposition has failed to state, we believe this round must fall to our side. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, side opposition views this debate through the minds of one of literary's greatest figures, William Shakespeare. We view this debate as a fundamental Shakespearean tragedy. Why is that? There's a fundamental misunderstanding on one side that has led to a lack of clash within this debate. At the end of the day, this is the Romeo and Juliet, this is the Macbeth of discussions on gender equality. Why is that? In my third speech today, I will be discussing two issues. First, I will be examining the role of the individual, and secondly, on the role of society, and explain to you why at the end of the day, co-educational schools must be favored. Now, side proposition brings us this point about how less distraction, how single-sex schools will ultimately lead to less distraction, therefore a better educational environment. And we think two things about this. We think first that that doesn't guarantee that there won't be distractions in a co-educational environment, but we think that secondly and more importantly, we think that by writing off gender interaction as a distraction to these students' educations, we think that's inherently flawed. We think that gender interaction and interacting with the opposite sex is the most important thing that co-educational schools have to offer. So by writing this off as a negative benefit, they're ultimately inherently wrong on this point. Secondly, we think that this is more important than any benefit that they can talk about. If all they can bring to the table is how maybe you won't be distracted on a math test versus equality in society around the world, then they ultimately aren't really bringing anything to the table. So at the end of the day, while these distractions can harm students on a small scale, the benefits that they gain from interactions far outweigh anything that proposition brings up. So now moving on to the side opposition's view on the role of the individual. We've told you today in our argument about the benefits of co-education, how we promote equal opportunity on an individual scale. Since men and women will be receiving the same education in the same institutions, they will all be the same at the individual level in terms of the quality of the education that they are receiving. Yet, let's view what side proposition system creates. A system that inherently promotes a different education for males and a different education for females. Now, why is that? We think that ultimately separatism is the opposite of equality. By saying that men and women will be equal if they go to separate institutions, that's ultimately illogical. If men and women are equal, then they deserve to have equal education and equal opportunities within school. That's what side opposition stands for. So, this means that for the individual, that if they attend single-sex institutions, they will be homogenized into a single education and that will ultimately develop an inherent single mindset for one gender. Yes?
But don't you agree that if women are the only priority, they will be the top priority?
Okay, they talk about this issue of priority, but we think that this undermines directly their point of equality. If they talk about empowerment, rising one gender over the other, giving empowerment to females, we think that this argument goes both ways, because we're talking about single-sex institutions for both males and for both females. We don't agree with this inherent idea of empowerment for females, nor empowerment for males. Why? We think that we stand for equality. We think that if we stand for equal education, that men and women go to the same institutions, then this idea of empowerment will be created. You don't create equality by rising one gender over the other. You create equality by giving them the same opportunities. That's why we win on this point as well. So, we think that these views that these individuals are given in co-educational institutions will ultimately give them better economic opportunities and better job opportunities in the future because they are given the same education. That's what side opposition stands for. Now, moving on to the second point and major point of how co-educational and single-sex institutions will impact society. In the third speech, they talk about how interaction doesn't really affect views. And then they talk in their second speaker about how male teachers might teach the best at male schools and vice versa. But we think that this ultimately shows why children will not be exposed to opposing or unique views in their education. If we have an institution that has all male students, yet we think that the best teachers to provide them their education are males, then we see that they won't have the opposing views or the complementary views of female teachers that will actually bring them to have a coexisting view on society. Yes?
Well, we clearly stated that we would not have only male teachers for boys' schools. We would have the teachers that we feel could best teach the group that we...
Yes, but your speaker said that that the male teachers might be the best qualified to teach at male schools and female teachers be the best qualified to teach at female schools. We think that this viewpoint is fundamentally wrong because children will not be exposed to opposing viewpoints or complementary, unique viewpoints by their teachers. We think that that's bad. Now, they talk about how the co-educational system doesn't alter political views, but we think that in stating that less distractions in the educational institution under single-sex schools will improve quality education, they agree that the environment that students are raised in is important. They talk about how if there's less distractions, then that will be better education. So that whole point is about the educational environment in which they are raised in. They somehow think that if we take genders and separate them, then they'll have less distractions. That's ultimately saying that the environment that they are taught in is important. So what does that mean? That means that if we agree that interaction with the other gender has the ability to alter views, which we fundamentally agree with, we think that if the educational environment is important, then when students are opposed to opposing views, that will ultimately be how they affect their political views, economic views, and all of that, all of those positive impacts that we have talked about. But let's get to the major question. They write up and down the bench about how students can have ability to interact with the other gender outside of school, yet they gloss over the fact of why education is important. We think that education gives students the opportunities to develop and integrate into society. Yet we also think that education is the sole place where students can interact with other people, they interact with teachers, and the school system is where they form their views about society. If we prefer an educational system in which students are separated by gender since they enter the system, and then once they leave the system and go into society and enter the workplace, enter the real world, yet they have been raised in an institution which men and women are seen as inherently different, then that ultimately leads to a separatist view of society once they enter it. So, then they bring us this point of they question why one gender is favored over another in these institutions. Well, it's interesting that they bring up the example of Pakistan, because Pakistan is representative of a multitude of countries, including countries like Saudi Arabia, and a much more variety of countries. In these countries, it's a male-dominated society. So we can infer that these opportunities are being given directly to men. So we think that if we favor single-sex institutions in these countries, males will be given more opportunities than women. What does this mean? We think that this directly goes against any point of equality that they can talk about. If men and women are being given different educations, then how does that create equality in society? Then they bring us this point of, well, if we're separating them, then women will want to attend institutions with all women. But we think that if they're not given the same education at the end of the day, we cannot expect them to be equal. Why is this important? We think that if we weigh the impacts in this debate, what side proposition can bring to the table, they bring to the table the point of less distraction. So even if we agree that there's less distractions within the educational system, if it's all males or all females, we still win this debate. We don't agree with that point, but we still win. Why? We can bring to the table the point of equality. We can bring to the table the point of showing how ultimately integrating male and female students into the same educational institution will ultimately bring about acceptance within society. We stand for equal opportunities for equal genders, not empowerment, favor one gender over another. That's why side opposition has won this debate. Thank you.
The speaker for the speech, time was 8 minutes and 6 seconds. In order to close the debate for their side of the House, I would like to invite the vice speaker to face opposition, Rochelle, to the first speech. Please.
Women are better qualified to teach at all girls schools, and men are better qualified to teach at all male schools. This is the language that we have seen said on the proposition and contradicted by their own team. And we argue that this language and this mindset, this sexist charged language, is exactly what team opposition is trying to stop, not only in schools, but in society today. So now I'm going to talk to you about a few things. First of all, why the proposition themselves are victim to the same assumptions that are inherent in society today. And those assumptions are sexist assumptions. And first of all, let's look at what they have argued. The gender interaction is distracting. We argue that if this was true, then why is it that universities promote diversity of thought? Why is it that they promote gender equality, different races to all be in the same institution? Because they see benefits to diversity of thought. We have shown you why this assumption is essentially false. We argue that they have been idealistic and naive in their approach to education, because they argue that if we have single-sex education, that they would be equal institutions. And we have shown you that they would not, that they say that they would be woman-focused and that would be a good thing. But we have shown you that maybe this would work in a perfect world where oppression of women never happens and that we don't have sexist ideals in society. But in a society that has those problems, we are only perpetuating the problem by excluding women and men from the same institutions. But let's move on to a situation in which the proposition's case is inherently true. So we have shown you why this is simply false. But at best, if the proposition, all the proposition can give us, all the benefits, is that we would have less distraction in schools. But we have seen that at worst, they would be giving essentially we would be giving the opportunity to governments and to organizations to give bad schools to women just to write them off as unimportant. We would be lacking diversity of thought in our nations, and we would be creating unsafe schools which are essentially ticking time bombs because organizations like the Taliban would be targeting them. We argue that at worst they are creating a dangerous precedent which could be used in other aspects of society to promote equality. And essentially at that point, when there are so little benefits and so many harms, it is clear that you should oppose this motion. So even if all of their arguments are true, we still win this debate. But in the end, we have shown you why diversity of thought and equality are true and more important than all of their arguments. So let's talk a little bit about diversity of thought. We argue that they have had a wish-washy stance all throughout the debate about whether interaction between genders is good outside of school, about whether men and women are both suited to teach in schools. But up and down the bench, team opposition has been consistent that diversity is always a good thing. That learning to coexist with someone else always promotes cooperation, understanding, and empathy, and that could create political change. We have shown you that, that these all-male schools may be more likely to be chauvinistic and sexist in viewpoints because they don't have to look a woman in the eye and say these things to them. And we have shown you that creating empathy and creating camaraderie, not only in a fun environment, but also in a serious environment, legitimizes the fact that women and men are equal. But moving on to this idea of equality, we have shown you that only team opposition will create equal resources for both men and women, because they would be going to the same school, creating the same equality in the quality of their education. And that is only something that team opposition has provided you today. We are not going to exclude one gender from the education system. We have shown you that the women would be less likely to disprove the rationalizations of sexism when they are trapped in a cycle that only gives them less quality education, only puts them out in the workforce where they may not be able to do as well as men because of their less quality of education. And we see this cycle that never ends because team proposition believes that single-sex education would essentially take away the distraction of men and women liking each other. And we say that this in itself is dangerous, offensive, and will create a terrible precedent for the future. So we urge you to oppose. Thank you.
And to close the debate for her side and the debate as a whole, I would now like to call on the vice speaker of today's proposition to deliver her speech. Please welcome her.
Mr. Speaker, today we've heard from an idealist side opposition that tells you that there's no sexism in these co-educational schools and that everybody works together regardless of gender. Today on Side Proposition, we have proved to you on a multiple of levels why this is inherently false. Today I'm going to go through what I think are the three main cruxes of this debate: education, boys and girls interaction, and equality. So first, starting on education. So they talked a lot about how education is for social interaction. And on side proposition, we brought forth the main argument that education is for optimal learning, regardless of whether optimal learning is with boys and girls, or with boys separate and girls separate, as we developed in our as we talked about in our model. Whereas we'd leave co-educational schools open, but we largely prefer single-sex schools. So they also talked a lot about how they're not given the same education. The boys' schools will inherently be better. We think that A, they are given the same education, just in a way that they learn, because it's been proven that boys and girls learn differently. And B, we don't think the boys' schools are necessarily going to be better. We have an example that in Nova Scotia, all of the single-sex schools up until 2009 have been girls' school until the recent development of the Fountain Academy boys' school. So I also want to bring forth a point from side proposition that we tried to bring forth in many POIs that weren't taken. That if single-sex schools really don't work, if they're really this bad, why do so many still exist today? Why are so many of these students still able to go out into the workforce, go into education, as my alma colleague proved with his statistic? If single-sex schools are honestly that bad, A, why is there still continuing, and B, why are still people going to them? And we think that's the point they're really struggling to refute. On to girls and boys interactions. So they stated that they will not work well with boys in the real world. And we refuted this by bringing forth the points that they're meeting outside of school with examples of debating. And we were trying to bring forth the point that I go to an all-girls school and I seem to be fine working with 2 males on my debate team. My brain has not melted out of my ears. And we think that boys and girls can work together, but we think that they work better together. We think that they work better separately. And we see that that's the distinction in our case. They talked about how it's always better together. And we acknowledge that we do not live in an idealistic world where we think that everyone can get on perfectly fine together. We think that, true, they probably can work together, and they'll not, like, die of shock that there's boys there. But at the same time, we think that they work better separately. And I clearly just stated, despite what they were claiming, that we would hire the best teacher suited to what they want, not that we would hire male teachers for male schools or female teachers for female schools. I simply provided that as an example because they were arguing with me before that. They're saying that, like, they were really unclear on that stance there. We made it very clear what our stance was, and they really seem to have not grasped that. So, and then they also, this is tying into that point of girls and boys interaction, this is talking about teachers. And it was something that they were talking about, and they misquoted me, saying that either males were more qualified to teach males, females were more qualified to teach females. I never, ever, and down the bench we never, ever stated that. If they had listened to the rest of our sentences, the rest of our model, it was simply we would choose who was the best. And that was a clear flaw in their case, that they really didn't grasp what we were talking about. On to equality. How does separating boys and girls promote sexism? When we asked them to back this up, they never really backed it up further than just, because they're separate and we kind of empower some of them. We don't think that's bad, and this ties into the next point under equality. In the Middle East, maybe you need to empower females to the point where they believe they are equal to males. We don't think we're promoting one over the other. We're simply saying that we're promoting them to tell them that they are equal, and that's good. So for all the reasons we brought forth today, all the reasons that opposition has brought forth today, we beg to propose. Thank you.
And the speaker for the speech time was 4 minutes and 28 seconds. I would now like to ask the speakers to cross the floor, shake hands,
That was a really good debate.
Good debate.
Great
Good
job.
debate. Thank you. You too.
Great speech. Wait, we have maple candies.
Do we have maple candies? 1 minute.